A white passenger grabbed a black CEO in anger mid-flight. He had no idea the man he just disrespected would end his trip, and his career, in seconds. She thought embarrassing him would make her powerful. She didn't realize the whole cabin was about to witness her downfall. Subscribe if you believe dignity always wins in the end. The moment the seatbelt sign blinked off with a muted chime, Adrian Holt rose from his seat with quiet precision. The cabin had just settled into the soft hum of altitude, the lull that comes once the engine stops straining and the earth falls away behind you. Adrian, dressed in a navy blue tailored suit, adjusted his cuffs with unconscious elegance, the silver cufflinks glinting faintly under the cabin lights. He had flown hundreds of times, yet even now, each ascent felt like a moment to reclaim stillness before the next corporate war. He reached overhead to retrieve a slim tablet from the storage compartment, the screen already cued to the merger draft for Valaris Dynamics and Atherin Core Defense. His mind was on closing loopholes in Clause 7B, not on the passenger 2 seats over. Not yet. But Gordon Vale made his presence impossible to ignore. A man in his late 50s, stocky and weathered, Gordon had boarded reeking faintly of stale whiskey and something oily. Cologne, perhaps, or engine grease. He wore a wrinkled utility jacket and tapped his boot against the floor with a rhythm that wasn't random. It was provocation. For the first half hour, Adrian ignored the mutters. They came like static, grumbles about suits, pencil pushers, and overpaid parasites. The kind of rant one usually writes off as drunken cabin talk. But then came a shift, barely perceptible, but sharp enough to cut. "They let anyone in first class these days," Gordon said loud enough for the nearest 3 rows to hear. His voice was gravelly, smug. He didn't look at Adrian directly. Instead, he sipped from a plastic cup of what looked like ginger ale, though the scent suggested something far stronger. Adrian's fingers hovered above the tablet screen. He didn't lift his head, not immediately. The comment hung in the pressurized air like a slow leak. A flight attendant, young, slight, clearly new, glanced over nervously, her lips parted but words caught behind them. She said nothing, walked on. The passengers around them shifted uncomfortably. One man adjusted his glasses and returned to his crossword. Another woman peeked over the top of her blanket, uncertain whether to intervene or stay invisible. That's what tension did in confined places. It silenced the brave and emboldened the reckless. Adrian finally turned. His eyes, a cool steel gray, met Gordon's bloodshot gaze with the kind of measured calm that unnerves more than anger ever could. "Sir," Adrian said, his voice low and unwavering, "I suggest you keep your words as decent as the altitude." Gordon chuckled, a dry, sardonic bark that curled in the back of his throat. "Touchy," he muttered, though his posture tensed slightly. The smirk faded from his lips, replaced with something unreadable, something dangerous. Adrian returned to his seat, adjusted the tablet's brightness, and continued reading. But the atmosphere had changed. He could feel it, an energy that clung to the corners of the cabin like smoke. The stewardess returned briefly, asking if anyone needed anything. Gordon waved her off with a lazy hand, while Adrian politely declined. The woman hesitated, eyes flicking between the 2 men, but moved on without a word. The cabin lights dimmed to their cruising tone, cooler, more muted. Outside, clouds rolled past in streaks of pale gray. Adrian marked a section of the document, highlighting 3 lines for revision. But his concentration was thin. Not from fear, Adrian had faced far worse threats in his life, but from analysis. He had learned to trust the sharp pull in his chest that warned of storms before they came. It was the same instinct that had gotten him through hostile acquisitions, courtroom ambushes, and negotiations that turned into corporate knife fights. And now, it was whispering something urgent. Something about Gordon wasn't spontaneous. Drunk passengers didn't quote lines like entitled suits unless they had something rehearsed in their heads, and the way his hands moved, slow, careful, not clumsy. This wasn't just drunken aggression. It was controlled bitterness, rehearsed venom. Adrian reached for his water, casually surveying the cabin. The man behind him was asleep. The one in the window seat 2 rows up was watching a film. No air marshal in sight, not visibly anyway. Just the endless hush of engines and the thrum of distrust spreading like fog. Gordon leaned back, one leg jittering against the metal bar under the seat, but his eyes never left Adrian now. His lips curled just slightly, as if amused by something only he understood. Adrian tapped a final note on his tablet, then closed the cover. His mind was no longer on mergers. The steward passed once more. He paused near Adrian but didn't say a word. The unspoken exchange between them was clear. "Something's off, but I don't know what to do." Adrian gave a brief nod, acknowledgement, not comfort. They were all trapped in the same pressurized steel tube 30,000 feet above the earth, and now a single unpredictable man had changed the oxygen. There was no shouting yet, no threats, no hands raised. But Adrian had seen how quickly moments like this could spiral. He'd seen it in back rooms and boardrooms when a single sentence tipped the balance of years. You didn't wait for chaos to declare itself. You observed, measured, acted with precision. He inhaled deeply, letting the recycled cabin air fill his lungs. His heart wasn't racing, not yet, but it had shifted its rhythm, a quiet readiness settling into his muscles. And still, Gordon kept watching. The cabin returned to silence, but not peace. It was the kind of silence that breaks right before something irreversible. The first kick came as a dull thump against the base of Adrian's seat, sharp enough to jolt him forward slightly, but not enough to warrant a confrontation. He glanced back over his shoulder. Gordon Vale's legs were stretched out with deliberate arrogance, his eyes half-lidded, his mouth twisted into a sneer. Adrian didn't respond. He adjusted his posture, angled his shoulders away, and returned to his tablet. The second kick came harder. Adrian closed his eyes for a beat, then looked up from the financial forecast displayed on his screen. The cabin around him hummed with artificial calm, the steady drone of the engines, the occasional rustle of napkins or soda cans, the polite whispers between passengers. But none of it reached the space between seats 3A and 3C, where tension had begun to condense like a storm cloud. "You can stop now," Adrian said, not looking back. His voice was calm, flat, and dangerous in its restraint. Gordon's reply was a low laugh, dry, humorless, and laced with something darker. "You think you're better than everyone else because you wear that fancy watch and talk like a man who never had to bleed for anything." Adrian didn't answer. He turned his face slightly toward the window, catching the soft reflection of himself in the plexiglass. His expression was unreadable, but behind it churned the silent gears of preparation. He could feel the direction this was heading, not out of paranoia, but from a lifetime of reading the moment before a deal collapsed or a threat revealed its teeth. Then, in a movement so swift it barely registered, Gordon reached into the side pocket of his worn jacket. What he pulled out wasn't a phone or a pen, but a pair of small metallic pliers. Not something that belonged in a carry-on, not something harmless. The aisle seemed to narrow instantly, the air around them thickening. A passenger across the row inhaled sharply. Another leaned forward slightly, sensing the change. The light above flickered, almost theatrically. "You think you're untouchable, don't you?" Gordon hissed, his voice rising with each word. Adrian turned, but not fast enough. Gordon lunged across the narrow aisle, his hand lightning fast, fingers coiling around Adrian's left ear. The pliers came down with a sickening snap, clamping near the top curve of the cartilage. Before Adrian could react, Gordon yanked back hard. The pain was instant and electric. Adrian's head whipped sideways with the force, his spine arching as a searing white flash tore through his skull. Warm blood spilled in a rush, soaking into the shoulder of his tailored navy suit and trailing down his jawline. He heard the sound of a woman gasping, Another man yelled something incoherent, but it all felt distant, muffled, like he was submerged underwater with only the vibration of chaos reaching his ears. The pliers still hovered near his face, Gordon's hand twitching as he brandished them like a grotesque trophy. A flight attendant, mid-30s, tall, with a badge that read T. Mercer, rushed down the aisle and froze at the sight. "Sir, drop the tool," he shouted, trying to wedge himself between the seats, but Gordon waved the pliers at him like a knife. "Get back," he barked. "He deserved it. These people think money makes them gods." Several passengers stood or twisted in their seats, phones rising to record. Adrian saw the glowing screens flicker into life through his bloodied vision. But even in the agony, something inside him clicked into place. He didn't scream. He didn't strike back. He measured. He breathed, slow and deep, jaw clenched tightly to suppress the shaking rage that fought to rise. His training from years past, combat simulations, stress drills, hostile negotiation rooms, rose unbidden from memory. This was not about pain. It was about power, and power could not be reclaimed in a panic. Across from him, Gordon's manic energy burned bright, like a fire that didn't care what it consumed. "You think you're safe behind that name of yours?" he spat. "Valaris Dynamics. Big CEO. All the same to me." Adrian blinked, blood now trailing from his ear down his collarbone. The seat beneath him was slick with it. His right hand, resting just inches from his lap, curled into a fist, but remained still. He studied Gordon's grip on the pliers, the slight tremor in the man's fingers, the way his wrist hovered just beyond Adrian's reach. He waited. Flight attendant Mercer tried again, voice firmer. "Sir, I need you to back away now. Security has been called. If you escalate, you will be restrained." Gordon laughed again, wild and proud. "You think I care? You think this is about jail time? I want the world to see this, to see what happens when you take everything from a man." Adrian's gaze didn't waver. The dizziness was coming now, shock was setting in, but he fought it back, and then came the thought, precise, cutting, and cold. The man who strikes first, Adrian told himself, rarely wins the last. Blood soaked through the fine collar of Adrian Holt's navy suit, the warm streaks tracing down his neck in a slow, burning trail. His jaw clenched as he held a folded napkin to his torn ear, the fabric already saturated. Around him, the first-class cabin was no longer silent. It was tense, loud with startled gasps and the muffled sobs of nervous passengers. But Adrian's mind was unnervingly calm. Chaos had descended, but he wasn't in it. He was above it, calculating, breathing, watching. Every sound seemed distant, muffled behind the rush of adrenaline that surged through his veins like a second heartbeat. Across the narrow aisle, Gordon Vale stood unhinged, his chest heaving, face flushed, eyes wild with whatever cocktail of rage and delusion had driven him this far. His hand still trembled from the force of his last strike, though now it hung awkwardly, uncertain of its next move. The pliers had disappeared for a moment into his grip, then reappeared, their small jaws glinting under the cabin lights like a surgeon's cruel tool. "I'll teach you what real men bleed like," Gordon spat, loud enough to make the nearest passengers flinch. His voice was thick with whiskey and misplaced vengeance. Adrian didn't speak. His eyes never left Gordon. The sting in his ear was sharp, his balance slightly off, but his thoughts were perfectly aligned. He shifted his weight, subtly testing the floor beneath his polished shoes, taking mental note of his proximity to the seat arm, the narrow aisle, the overhead compartment. Everything was a variable. Every inch mattered. Then Gordon moved. He lunged, not like a soldier or a boxer, but like a drunk man trying to end a grudge with one last stupid blow. It was fast, but uncoordinated. His arm slashed toward Adrian's throat, the pliers aimed clumsily like a dagger. Adrian's instincts activated like clockwork. His left hand dropped the blood-soaked napkin, and his right shot up, not to block, but to intercept. He caught Gordon's wrist mid-air, his fingers clamping around it with a grip honed from years of discipline, not gym sessions. There was a loud, wet smack as their bodies collided, Adrian's seated form coiling like a spring. Gordon bent halfway into the row, his momentum now working against him. The pliers dropped with a hollow clatter, spinning once before landing near the aisle's center line. For a moment, everything paused. Gordon's face was only inches from Adrian's now. His eyes no longer wild with confidence, they were confused, flickering with the sudden realization that the balance had shifted. His mouth opened, perhaps to curse, perhaps to beg, but no words came. Just air. "You shouldn't have touched me," Adrian said, his voice barely above a whisper, but it carried. His tone wasn't angry. It was cold, measured, the kind of voice that didn't threaten, it delivered verdicts. With precise control, Adrian twisted Gordon's wrist backward, slowly, deliberately. The angle shifted until joints strained and skin stretched. Gordon yelped, then cried out louder, his knees buckling as pain shot through his arm like fire. His body twisted to escape, but Adrian held him steady, forcing him down slightly, reversing the attack into submission. Blood from Adrian's jawline dripped onto Gordon's sleeve, thick red drops marking the attacker like ink on a confession letter. "Please," Gordon hissed, his breath hitched, but it was far too late for mercy. The flight attendants were shouting now, their voices rising in panic and pleading, trying to de-escalate from the galley. A male steward named Dean moved forward cautiously, hands raised, eyes darting between Adrian and the weapon on the floor. But Adrian didn't move toward the pliers. He moved toward closure. Releasing Gordon's twisted arm in a controlled snap, Adrian gripped the man's shoulder, shoving him halfway back with one hand. Gordon stumbled, dazed. That gave Adrian just enough room to bend down and retrieve the pliers. His fingers closed around the cold metal without hesitation. His breaths came slower now, not from calm, but control under pressure. Gordon groaned and rose slightly again, hand over his own face, but Adrian was already upon him. With one swift step, he reached up, gripped Gordon's head, and leaned in close. The cabin erupted again with shouts, some calling for help, others crying out in disbelief. Then it happened. With a motion so fast and precise it felt rehearsed, Adrian snapped the pliers open, anchored them just behind Gordon's left ear, and ripped. A wet, tearing sound followed, visceral and unforgettable. Gordon's scream was sharp and animalistic, echoing through the pressurized cabin. The passengers nearby ducked or gasped, and even the steward halted in horror, frozen by the raw brutality of what had just occurred. Blood sprayed. Not a mist, but a thick stream, coating Adrian's forearm and splashing onto the aisle floor. Gordon dropped to his knees with a grunt, clutching his head, his entire body trembling. Adrian stood over him, breathing heavily. His suit was ruined. His ear throbbed. His hands were wet with someone else's rage. But his eyes were steady, sharp, and frighteningly alive. Without a word, he looked down at the object in his hand. A severed human ear. He didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. Instead, Adrian knelt slowly, deliberately, and extended his arm toward Gordon like an executioner offering the price of a failed duel. He placed the bloody ear into Gordon's trembling lap with surgical care, as if handing him the receipt for his own cruelty. Then he leaned closer, his voice steady and clear. "Now you know what respect costs." The scream split the cabin like a fault line, a raw, jagged wail that silenced every conversation, snapped every pair of eyes forward, and sucked the air out of first class. Gordon Vale's hand clutched the side of his face, blood pouring between his fingers like red ink-soaking paper. His voice was no longer cruel or mocking. It was high-pitched, broken, almost childlike. "My ear! My ear!" he howled, staggering backward into his seat, shaking violently as passengers recoiled away from him. A few cried out. Others just stared, paralyzed by shock. Blood dripped to the floor, a slow tap-tap-tap against the synthetic carpet. Adrian Holt didn't move. He sat upright in his seat, his blood-stained fingers resting calmly on his lap, his breathing measured. The pliers rested on the tray in front of him, coated in blood but placed with almost clinical precision. His face was still bleeding, thick streaks of crimson trailing down from the side of his own torn ear, but his eyes remained locked forward, watching nothing, seeing everything. It wasn't rage that lived behind his gaze now, it was calculation. He had struck back with precision, not vengeance, and that unsettled everyone more than the violence itself. Flight attendants surged forward, tripping over themselves in panic. One, a young man named Connor, fumbled for the cabin phone and shouted toward the cockpit, "Emergency! We need medical. Passenger severely injured. Divert immediately." Another attendant tried to get near Gordon but recoiled when he saw the mess of tissue and blood. Adrian looked up slowly and said, in a clear, steady voice, "There's no need to panic." He brought this on himself. Two passengers, one in a business blazer, the other a retired firefighter in a windbreaker, rushed toward Adrian to restrain him. But Adrian raised his hands, slowly and deliberately, palms open and stained red. "I'm not resisting," he said. "I defended myself." His tone wasn't defensive, it was declarative, like he was stating facts for a transcript. The firefighter hesitated, then nodded and stepped back. The cabin lights flickered briefly as the plane began a slow bank left. Overhead, the captain's voice came on, calm but clipped. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We've declared an emergency and will be diverting to the nearest airport for medical and security assistance. Please remain in your seats." Adrian's attention drifted upward. He pointed once toward the small black camera above the aisle, its blinking red light a quiet witness to everything. "That recording has all the answers," he said. "Start there." The man in the blazer followed his gaze and nodded slowly, realizing what Adrian meant. The evidence was already sealed in silicon. At that moment, the air marshal emerged from the rear section. Tall, broad-shouldered, his badge displayed openly and a sidearm drawn. "Hands up," he barked. Adrian, still seated, raised his bloodied arms again without protest. The marshal's eyes scanned the scene, taking in the carnage, the tools, the witnesses. His gun never wavered, but he didn't fire. "What happened?" he asked sharply. "I defended myself," Adrian repeated. His voice didn't rise. He didn't try to explain further. He just gestured once more toward the ceiling camera. "Everything you need to see is recorded." The marshal's gaze narrowed. He lowered the weapon an inch, signaling the flight crew to stand down. One of them handed him the pliers, wrapped hastily in a vomit bag. The marshal inspected it, then looked back at Adrian's slashed ear, then at Gordon, still shrieking, now rocking back and forth like a child, clutching a blood-soaked napkin to what remained of his left ear. The chaos receded slightly, leaving behind only a thick silence. In that silence, Adrian turned his face toward the window. The clouds outside were smooth, glowing faintly with sunlight. The vast emptiness beyond the glass felt like a strange mirror to the wreckage inside. He watched it quietly, chest still rising and falling with effort. Somewhere behind him, a passenger sobbed softly. The engines hummed steadily as if the plane had detached from reality altogether. The scent of blood had overtaken the cabin. It was sharp and metallic, clinging to the upholstery, to people's clothing, to the air itself. No one dared to speak. Even those who had doubted Adrian earlier now looked at him differently. He wasn't some boardroom brute who lost his temper. He was something colder, more exact. Minutes passed. The pilot came on again, announcing their approach to Norvale Airfield, a small emergency strip rerouted for medical landings. Flight attendants distributed oxygen masks to calm passengers even though they weren't needed. Someone offered Adrian a wet towel, which he took politely and used to press against the still bleeding side of his face. He didn't flinch from the pain. He wore it. From the front, a medic stepped in, guiding a stretcher toward Gordon, who was now whimpering. barely coherent. As the stretcher passed Adrian's seat, the two men's eyes met. For a brief second, Gordon's face twisted, not in hatred, but in fear. Pure, helpless fear. Adrian looked back with no emotion at all. Outside the window, the horizon tilted slightly as the plane descended, the runway lights of Norvale flickering in the distance like quiet beacons. Adrian inhaled deeply through his nose and exhaled slowly, feeling every breath scrape against the raw edge of his throat. He wasn't afraid of the investigation. He wasn't afraid of the headlines. He was only afraid of silence, of letting this story be shaped by others. Because this wasn't about rage. This was about message, about drawing a line that some hands should never cross. The attendant approached again, hesitantly. "Sir, we'll be landing shortly. Please stay seated until security boards." Adrian nodded. His voice was low but certain. "I'm not going anywhere." Outside, the world rushed closer. Inside, the story had already taken flight. The irony wasn't lost on him. The higher they flew, the lower humanity sometimes sank. Sometimes justice bleeds before it breathes. The runway lights blurred beneath the descending aircraft, streaks of amber and red cutting through the night rain as the jet touched down hard. The jolt threw passengers forward. Gasps filled the cabin as oxygen masks swung loosely from their hinges. "We're on the ground," the pilot's strained voice announced, but the relief was fragile, trembling in the aftermath of chaos. Two paramedics stood ready by the terminal gate, flanked by armed officers. The doors opened with a hiss, and cold air rushed in, sharp, metallic, alive with sirens. Adrian Holt stood slowly, his navy suit darkened with blood down the left side, his movements deliberate, every gesture measured. The world around him blurred into motion. Flight attendants ushering crying passengers, medics lifting the injured man. But Adrian remained anchored in eerie calm. His ear throbbed beneath a hastily wrapped napkin, yet his focus never left the trembling figure of Gordon Vale, who was being wheeled out on a stretcher, his face half covered in gauze, shouting hoarsely, "He tried to kill me! He's insane!" The corridor outside the aircraft glowed with harsh floodlights, revealing chaos in clean, surgical clarity. A dozen uniformed officers waited at the bottom of the stairs, their radios crackling with clipped commands. Adrian stepped down slowly, the wet tarmac reflecting every step like a fractured mirror. An officer extended a hand to steady him, but Adrian waved it off with quiet dignity. "I can walk," he said. His voice was steady, controlled, eerily so given the carnage behind him. In the distance, reporters pressed against barricades, flashes pulsing like lightning through the mist. One shouted, "Mr. Holt, did you attack the man first?" Another yelled, "Is it true you used the pliers?" He ignored them all. Truth would come later. Control was now. Inside the terminal's secured wing, the atmosphere shifted from chaos to suffocating quiet. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the air as officers moved briskly, separating Adrian from the rest of the passengers. His shoes left faint reddish prints on the linoleum floor. Officer Rayner, a tall man with weathered features and a calm authority born from years in crisis response, approached with slow precision. He carried a tablet showing the frozen image from the flight's security feed. Gordon lunging, the metallic glint of the pliers caught midair. "You knew exactly what you were doing," Rayner said, his tone neither accusing nor admiring, but curious, like a man dissecting a storm. Adrian's eyes lifted, steady and sharp. "I knew what not to do," he replied. "Lose control." Rayner studied him for a long moment, then nodded to the paramedic to finish dressing the wound. The bandages tightened around Adrian's ear, a dull ache pulsing with each heartbeat. "You've got people calling you a hero already," Rayner said quietly, "and others calling you a menace." Adrian gave a faint, humorless smile. "Truth takes longer to land than a plane," he murmured. The officer's expression softened slightly. He'd seen men crack under far less, but Adrian didn't tremble, didn't pace. He sat perfectly still, his fingers resting lightly on his knees, every motion controlled by discipline older than the pain. That calm unsettled even the professionals in the room. Outside, the scene had transformed into a media circus. A dozen news vans lined the runway, microphones poised toward the terminal. The world had already begun writing its story before evidence was even logged. CEO assaults passenger in first-class meltdown. One anchor rehearsed in front of a camera. Inside, however, the truth played slower, frame by frame, replayed on Rayner's tablet. Each still image revealed something damning or redeeming, depending on who held the screen. The first showed Gordon sneering. The second, the pliers raised. The third, Adrian's restrained counter. And then the fourth, the severed ear, a symbol of consequence no one could ignore. As the questioning continued, Adrian's thoughts wandered, not to guilt, but to motive. Why would a stranger bring pliers aboard a commercial flight? Why target him specifically? The logic unraveled in his mind like a wire being stripped bare. This wasn't coincidence. The precision of the attack, the way Gordon taunted him before striking, it felt rehearsed. Rayner noticed his silence and leaned closer. "Something's on your mind," he said. Adrian didn't look up. "Yes," he answered softly, "but not something I can prove yet." The officer frowned, sensing layers beneath the calm exterior. "You think this wasn't random?" Adrian gave the smallest nod. "No one carries a weapon by accident." Especially not one that cuts clean hours later. As the investigation room emptied and the adrenaline faded into a hollow exhaustion, Adrian found himself seated near a window overlooking the drenched airfield. Police cruisers flashed red and blue reflections across the glass, painting his reflection in colors of authority and suspicion. A young officer entered with a clipboard. "Sir, they'll escort you to the precinct for statements." Adrian rose without protest, his voice measured. "Just make sure you have the footage secured," he said. The officer hesitated, then nodded. "It's already been uploaded to evidence storage." Adrian gave a faint nod in return, half acknowledgement, half warning. Control, after all, was his only remaining weapon. As he was led outside, rain tapped gently against the covered walkway, turning the bloodstains on his shirt into faint watercolor streaks. Reporters surged forward behind the barricades, shouting questions lost in the storm. The police vehicle door opened, and Adrian paused before stepping in. His eyes caught the faint shimmer of the blood trail glistening under the floodlights, a line from the aircraft steps to the van. For a moment he simply stared at it, the reflection of red and white lights merging into one. Inside his mind, the thought came cold and clear, echoing against the chaos of the night. Survival demanded precision, not mercy. And as the door shut with a final metallic click, he thought quietly to himself, "In the age of cameras, truth travels slower than rumor." The moment the heavy door clicked shut behind him, Adrian Holt felt the isolation tighten like a noose. The security holding room was the kind of place designed to erase comfort. 4 pale walls, no windows, and a ceiling of buzzing fluorescent lights that made the blood seeping through his ear bandages look even more vivid. The steel chair beneath him was bolted to the floor, and the table in front of him had a single folder resting atop it, neat, centered, deliberate. Nothing else. Officer Rayner entered without a word, the door hissing closed behind him. He didn't sit immediately. Instead, he walked to the corner of the room, adjusted the camera angle mounted on the ceiling, then returned to the table. Only then did he place a recorder between them and press it on. "Interview commencing," he said in a low, professional tone. Subject: Adrian Holt. Date and time stamped. He flipped open the folder, revealing a series of still images printed in crisp monochrome, each one a frozen moment from the surveillance footage aboard the aircraft. Rayner laid the images out like puzzle pieces. One of Gordon Vale mid-lunge, pliers in hand, another of Adrian recoiling, blood beginning to streak down his neck. The final still, Adrian holding the pliers in his right hand, Gordon's face twisted in agony. "You had every right to defend yourself," Rayner began slowly, tapping the first photo. "But you went further." Adrian didn't blink. His gaze moved from the photos to Rayner's face with the same precision he used in shareholder meetings, measured, analytical, aware of every twitch of reaction. "Further," he replied, voice steady, "is what people like him never expect." Rayner exhaled quietly, then leaned back, folding his arms. He wasn't hostile, but there was a weight in his expression, a silent question he hadn't yet asked. His uniform was crisp, his posture exact, but Adrian noticed the faint scarring near his knuckles, the kind that came from years of jobs that didn't go smoothly. This was a man who'd seen his share of violence. The empathy was there, buried beneath procedure. "I've dealt with plenty of incidents mid-flight," Rayner said after a pause. "Usually drunk passengers, a fight over armrests, someone refusing to wear a mask. But this—" He nodded toward the photos. "This was surgical." Adrian's jaw tightened. The bandage tugged slightly as he moved, a sting reminding him of every nerve torn by Vale's hand. But he didn't wince. "Surgical implies detachment," Adrian said. "I wasn't detached. I was very aware of what I was doing." Rayner studied him for a moment, then spoke, softer now. "You didn't lose control." "No," Adrian said, "because control was what they were trying to break." Rayner tilted his head. "They." Adrian didn't answer, not directly. His eyes fell back to the images, then lingered on the last one. "That man," he said, gesturing to Vale's twisted form, "didn't bring Pliers on board to fix the seatbelt. He wasn't looking for trouble. He was sent to cause it." Rayner sat forward slowly. "You think this was planned?" "I don't think," Adrian said. "I know." Outside the holding room, chaos brewed. Media vans clogged the airport perimeter, their dishes pointed like cannons toward the terminal. Headlines had already gone live. CEO assaults passenger in first class, violence at 30,000 feet. No mention of the weapon. No mention of the blood that flowed first. Commentators filled airwaves with speculation, trading facts for outrage. At Valaris Dynamics headquarters, Adrian's executive team scrambled. Emergency meetings, legal memos, drafted statements with words like incident, regret, and investigation, scattered like bandages on a bullet wound. No one dared say the one word that mattered most: intent. Inside the room, Rayner opened a side drawer and slid over a water bottle. "It's going to get worse before it gets better." Adrian unscrewed the cap but didn't drink. "I've managed hostile takeovers in 3 continents. Faced threats from regulators, activists, competitors. But this?" He looked up. "This wasn't business. This was personal." Tailored Rayner frowned. "Why would someone target you this way?" Adrian didn't hesitate. "Because the merger Valaris is pushing threatens someone powerful. Gordon Vale was a weapon, and someone wanted him to detonate in my lap." Rayner considered that, his fingers drumming the table. "You're not wrong about the Pliers. TSA missed them somehow, but missing doesn't mean conspiracy." Adrian finally took a small sip of water. "No, but coincidence rarely travels first class." There was a long silence. Rayner turned off the recorder. "Off the record?" Adrian nodded. Rayner leaned in. "I've seen setups before. During my years in counter-intel, we used to run provocations, send a man into the lion's den just to record the bite. What happened to you? That's the blueprint. Needle the target. Make him react. Then destroy his credibility." Adrian's voice was almost a whisper. It was too specific. Vale knew which ear I favored. He reached across instead of striking nearest. That's not random. That's trained. Rayner nodded slowly, absorbing the implication. You think you're being surveilled now? I know I am, Adrian said. He tapped his temple. They're not after my company. They're after what it represents. Control, stability, legacy. If they can fracture that image, they break the foundation. Rayner stood and began collecting the photos. I'll keep the formal charges pending review. The footage will help. But Adrian... He hesitated, then added, the media doesn't care about context. They sell the blood, not the reason it's spilled. Adrian's voice dropped to a murmur. That's why I don't explain. I act, Rayner nodded once. Then act smart. If this was an ambush, the next move won't be physical. It'll be public. He turned to leave, then paused. One last thing. If Vale was planted, you'll need more than truth. You'll need proof before they bury it. Adrian stood, slow but steady, adjusting the blood-specked bandage as he looked toward the one-way glass. Then I'd better start digging. Rayner offered a half nod and exited, the door locking behind him. Adrian remained still for a long time, his reflection faint in the glass. The hum of the overhead lights buzzed like static in his ears. He reached into his jacket pocket, not for a phone, not for notes, but for a worn silver pen. A gift from a former air defense instructor. He clicked it open, scribbled one word on the back of Rayner's water bottle label. Why? He didn't need to write the rest. He already knew that every answer started with intent. He looked up at the blank white wall in front of him, saw nothing, and saw everything. No one carries pliers onto a plane without purpose, he whispered to himself. Someone wanted that reaction. The precinct clock struck 9:47 p.m. when the door to Adrian Holt's holding room creaked open with deliberate slowness. The metallic sound echoed off the sterile walls like a warning. Adrian didn't turn. He sat at the edge of the small bench, his bloodied shirt stiff against his back, the bandage around his ear itching with dried crimson. His breath came slow, steady, not out of calm, but from discipline. Every muscle was coiled, ready for news or battle, whichever came first. Footsteps entered, calm and confident. Then came the voice, low, gravel-edged, familiar. "Still breathing, I see," said the man. Adrian turned sharply, not in alarm, but in recognition. Standing just inside the doorway was Detective Mason Corrin, his trench coat damp at the shoulders from the rain outside. He didn't wear a badge on his belt like the others. Mason didn't need to prove who he was. Adrian stood slowly. "Mason," he said, his voice clipped but not cold. "You always show up when something's burning." Mason gave a short nod, but there was no smile on his face. Only tension, carefully managed. He pulled out a chair across from Adrian and sat down without invitation, leaning forward and resting a manila folder between them. "We pulled Gordon Vale's background," Mason began. His tone was quiet but carried weight. "He's not who he says he is." Not just a contractor, Adrian's posture didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. "Go on." Mason opened the folder and slid a photo forward. It was a grainy image of Gordon, younger, standing in front of a building with the words Norex Systems, Advanced Logistics Division, stenciled faintly on a metal door behind him. "He used to work at Norex," Mason continued. "Filed a lawsuit against them 2 years ago. Claimed he was injured on a job site. Internal documents show he was dismissed shortly after. Lost his pension. Lost his house." Adrian absorbed this silently. The pieces were aligning faster than he'd expected, but not in a way he liked. "Why bring this to me now?" he asked. Mason leaned back, folding his arms. "Because last month someone at Norex paid off all of Vale's debt. Cleared it. Medical bills, foreclosure, the works. And a week later, he ends up seated next to you on a first-class flight." Adrian's jaw tensed, though his face remained composed. He sat back down, this time with a slow, deliberate motion. "They didn't just send a man," he said softly. "They sent a man who'd already lost everything." Mason nodded grimly. "Because nothing is more dangerous than a man with nothing left to lose." Silence settled between them for a long moment, broken only by the faint hum of the fluorescent light above. Adrian ran a hand down his face, feeling the dried blood crack beneath his fingertips. "I should have seen it coming," he muttered. "The aggression wasn't random. It was rehearsed, timed. He knew what buttons to push," Mason agreed, "and he had the tool ready. No one carries pliers onto a flight unless they know what they're planning." Adrian glanced at the photo again. Gordon's face looked so ordinary. Too ordinary. The kind of face no one would remember unless it erupted into violence. "So, what's the angle?" Adrian asked. "Sabotage my merger? Dismantle my credibility before I close on the defense contract? Or worse," Mason said, lowering his voice, "make you the face of a scandal you can't escape." He reached into his coat and pulled out a crisp white business card. He slid it across the table. "They'll spin this as assault," Mason warned, "unless you move fast." Find the motive before they find your weakness. Adrian didn't reach for the card immediately. He stared at it as if it were a key to a door he didn't want to open. The card had no name, just a number, and the outline of a hawk. "Mason," Adrian said, voice steady but tight. "I spent years building Valaris on facts, on proof, on logic. But this is personal, calculated, weaponized." Mason gave a single nod, stood, and headed for the door. He paused before leaving, casting one last look over his shoulder. "They're not just testing your limits, Adrian," he said. "They're hoping you'll break." When the door shut behind him, Adrian remained frozen for a beat. Then, slowly, he turned toward the glass wall that looked out over the dim hallway. His reflection stared back, bandaged, blood-streaked, eyes lit not by fear, but by purpose. The card remained on the table, untouched. As the clock ticked past midnight, Adrian stared at his reflection in the glass wall, one ear bandaged, the other listening for lies. Pain doesn't end the moment the bleeding stops, he thought. It begins when the truth starts whispering. She mocked and shouted at the CEO in front of everyone, convinced no one would dare intervene. If you believe truth needs no permission to speak, hit subscribe now. Justice doesn't hide, it shines. The message hit his inbox at 7:14 a.m. Adrian sat alone in his private office suite, the curtains still drawn against the morning sun. The metallic taste of blood still lingered in his mouth, a phantom reminder of the flight. He hadn't slept, his body was stiff, his bandaged ear still throbbing with each heartbeat, but his mind was sharp, honed by decades of corporate warfare and years in air defense before that. He'd been reviewing legal drafts when the notification popped up. One encrypted message. Subject, Delta 14. He clicked. The message was short, anonymous, but its tone cut like glass. Veil was planted. The pliers weren't random. Look deeper into Flight Manifest. Delta 14 attached was a spreadsheet, an official flight manifest cross-referenced against internal employee rosters from Norex Systems. Adrian's heart rate slowed rather than spiked. It was the kind of calm that only came when the gut finally caught up to what instinct had been whispering all along. He leaned forward, the light from the screen casting a cold reflection on the polished surface of his desk. The document listed 5 names. One of them was Gordon Vale. Another was marked as ground logistics support. 2 more were maintenance supervisors. All tied to Norex's internal risk division, an innocuous title with a far more sinister meaning when viewed in this context. These weren't just passengers. They were plants. He whispered the name. Flight Manifest Delta 14. Then again, louder, slower, as if saying it would make the pieces fall faster. His fingers trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of clarity. The entire incident had been staged, not just by a drunken man with a grudge, but by a corporation with something far more dangerous. Motive. "They didn't want to hurt me," Adrian muttered aloud. "They wanted to disqualify me." He stood abruptly, pushing the leather chair back. The pain in his jaw flared as he paced, but he welcomed it. It kept him focused. Less than a week from now, Adrian was set to finalize a merger with Halberd Strategic Defense, a move that would make Valaris Dynamics a top-tier supplier in both civilian and military tech. That kind of shift made enemies. And one of those enemies had orchestrated a public provocation so personal, so visceral, that any reaction would have been damaging. But they hadn't expected what they got. He grabbed his secure phone and dialed. 2 rings. "Dr. Rowan Latner," answered the voice on the other end, crisp and alert despite the hour. "I need you here." "Now," Adrian said. "I saw the news," Rowan replied. "You're already the headline. They're calling you both a threat and a hero." Adrian's voice was cold steel. "They tried to provoke me into self-destruction. It wasn't random. I have proof. You'll see when you get here." Within the hour, Rowan arrived, tall, angular, always dressed like a man who anticipated courtroom crossfire. Adrian slid the tablet across the table and watched as the strategist scanned the data. No words were exchanged for several minutes, just the clicking of keys and the occasional narrowing of Rowan's eyes. Then Rowan sat back and looked at Adrian, not with shock, but with a kind of quiet awe. "This isn't just corporate sabotage," he said. "This is psychological warfare." Adrian didn't blink. "They wanted footage of me cracking. Me bleeding. Me lashing out. They wanted to weaponize perception," Rowan added, tapping on a frame that showed Vale boarding the plane with no checked luggage. "They weren't testing your restraint. They were setting it up to fail." A long pause stretched between them. "They studied you," Rowan continued, voice lower now, "profiled your reactions. Banked on the pressure of the merger, the media attention. They needed the CEO who leads with discipline to look like a man who unravels under pressure." Adrian walked toward the window, drawing the curtain aside. The skyline of the city stared back at him, ambition carved in glass and steel. Somewhere in that view was the building that housed Norex's executive offices. Somewhere in that glass jungle, the people who orchestrated this sat behind polished desks, already spinning their version of the truth. "They didn't get what they came for," Adrian said finally. Rowan nodded. "Because you didn't lose control." Adrian turned slowly, the bandage on his ear pale against his skin. He moved to his desk and retrieved the pliers, now sealed in an evidence bag. He held it up for a long moment before setting it down carefully beside the manifest. "No," he said quietly. "I didn't lose control." He looked at Rowan, his voice steady. "I delivered consequence." Gordon Vale was lying in a sterile hospital bed, the hum of medical equipment providing a false sense of safety. His face was swaddled in fresh gauze, his breathing erratic but stable. Outside his room, a uniformed officer stood guard, arms crossed, half alert. But the hospital's calm was shattered when 2 men appeared at the end of the corridor. They didn't speak to the nurse or show ID. One wore a tailored gray suit, crisp and spotless. The other wore military-issue boots that thudded softly against the linoleum, each step measured like a silent countdown. They didn't ask for directions. They didn't need to. Inside the room, Gordon stirred as the taller man in the suit stepped to his bedside. His voice was flat, like steel cooled just short of shattering. "You failed the objective." That was all. No threats, no raised voices. Just that line, spoken with such quiet finality that even Gordon, bruised and bandaged, stopped breathing for a moment. The man in boots remained by the door, hands clasped behind his back, watching the hallway through narrowed eyes. Moments later, they were gone. Witnesses remembered their faces, but not their names. And within the hour, Gordon Vale was gone too. No alarms, no disturbance. The surveillance footage for that wing of the hospital? Wiped clean, as if Gordon had never existed at all. Miles away, the late-night traffic of Ardenshire moved with its usual sleepy rhythm, but one black SUV disrupted the flow. It trailed Adrian Holt's vehicle with practiced distance, never too close, never too far. Adrian noticed it in his rearview mirror just as he crossed the northbound span of the river bridge. The headlights weren't flickering like the others. The engine didn't rev or idle. It glided, steady, patient. He didn't panic. He didn't speed. He simply took the long way home, through the winding service road that looped under the bridge and curved along the edge of the industrial district. At one point, the car behind him turned off abruptly down an unlit access path and vanished into the mist. But Adrian knew better than to assume it was over. He reached his building and parked inside the underground garage, stepping out with deliberate slowness. The air was cold and still, the concrete echoing with each footstep. He scanned every corner, every shadow. His instincts from his air defense days weren't just memory, they were muscle. Reflex caution. Inside his penthouse, Adrian triple-locked the door and disabled every smart feature. No digital assistants, no cloud syncing, only analog silence and hardwired security. He closed the blackout curtains, poured a glass of water, and sat down at the edge of the couch, jaw tense. His phone buzzed on the coffee table. An unknown number, no ringtone, just a silent tremble. He picked it up and opened the message, encrypted like the last. Phase 2 begins when you stay silent. Adrian's lips parted slightly, not in surprise, but in something colder, recognition. This wasn't intimidation. It was confirmation. Confirmation that someone, somewhere, expected him to retreat, to keep his head down, to let the incident pass as scandal, not signal. But Adrian Holt had never been the kind of man who let fear write the ending. He stood, moved to his study, and opened the concealed panel behind the bookshelf. Inside was a standalone server unit. No network connection. No outside access. Just raw memory. Here he began uploading everything. Every frame of cabin footage. Every photo. Every timestamp from the airport, the holding room. Even the encrypted messages. He organized them into folders, each labeled and cross-indexed. He named the master directory Operation Vale. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't paranoia. It was something sharper. He leaned over the desk, breathing through his teeth as the burn in his jaw pulsed again. He didn't look at his reflection in the darkened monitor screen, but he could feel the scar behind the bandage tightening. Not from pain. From purpose. They had tried to provoke him, then erase their failure. They wanted him to break. Instead, he was preparing. When Mason Corrin called, Adrian answered before the first ring ended. "He's gone," Mason said without greeting. Vale vanished an hour ago. Security footage corrupted. 2 guys in and out without a trace. It's like they rehearsed it. Adrian didn't blink. "They're cleaning up," he said, almost to himself. Mason exhaled on the other end. "You're not safe." "This wasn't just a setup. It's ongoing." "I know," Adrian replied, "and that's why I won't be quiet." The call ended. Outside, fog rolled in over the rooftops. Adrian returned to the server and finished encrypting the final batch of files. His phone buzzed again. Another unknown message. Just a string of numbers this time. A countdown? A threat? Or a signal to someone else? It didn't matter. He unplugged the server drive, locked it in a steel case, and placed it in a concealed safe behind a wall panel. His movements were calm, unhurried, but his mind ran like a war drum. They had underestimated him. That was their first mistake. Now he was giving them a new variable, one they hadn't calculated. Not outrage, not retaliation. Strategy. He stared out the window toward the city skyline swallowed by mist and whispered into the silence. "The difference between reaction and strategy," he whispered, is that one ends the fight and the other wins it. Adrian stepped onto the stage with a bandage still wrapped tightly around the side of his face, the left edge stained faintly with dried blood. The press conference room inside the Valaris Dynamics Media Hall was at full capacity, reporters shoulder to shoulder, flashes igniting in bursts like a battlefield of camera fire. He didn't pause at the podium. He didn't offer pleasantries. His hand moved calmly across the remote control in his grip, and the main screen behind him lit up with the first frame of the in-flight footage. The crowd quieted instantly. No narration, no legal counsel, just raw truth. In stark, silent frames, the assault unfolded, the overhead cabin camera capturing Gordon Vale pulling the pliers, the sickening jerk of Adrian's body as flesh tore, and the blood that followed like a burst pipe under pressure. Gasps rippled through the room. Some reporters lowered their phones, too stunned to continue recording. Adrian let it play to the final frame, Vale shrieking, Adrian calm, the severed ear in Gordon's lap like a symbol of irreversible lines crossed. Only then did Adrian speak. His voice, low and even, cut clean through the silence. What you just saw was the truth. Not the headlines, not the social media distortion, not the whisper campaign. He clicked again, bringing up a still image, Vale's face, cross-referenced with internal files. This man, Gordon Vale, was not a random passenger. He was a former contractor for Norex Systems. He clicked again. 2 years ago, he lost a workplace injury lawsuit against them, and 1 month before this flight, all his personal debt was erased by a shell entity, owned by a Norex Systems subsidiary. The room shifted, energy changing from shock to something sharper. Interest, alarm, recognition. More slides appeared, financial transfers, time-stamped memos, and a detailed shot of the flight manifest. This is not an isolated incident. This is a pattern, Adrian continued, his voice building like the slow swell of a drumbeat. They sent a man with nothing to lose to provoke a man with everything to protect. They weren't testing my composure. They were testing my collapse. He paused. And they failed. A hand shot up from a reporter in the front. Mr. Holt, are you suggesting this was a coordinated attempt to sabotage the merger between Valaris and Renwell Defense? I'm not suggesting, Adrian said plainly. I'm confirming. He pressed another button. The screen shifted again, email fragments recovered from a deleted Norex archive, hastily reconstructed by digital forensic teams. Phrases appeared. Force exposure, psychological destabilization, and, most damning, trigger asset engagement during Delta 14. The room erupted. Dozens of reporters began shouting over each other, their voices colliding in a storm of disbelief and urgency. Adrian didn't flinch. He raised one hand slowly, signaling calm, not asking for silence, commanding it. I was meant to be broken on camera, he said, quieter now, so they could paint me as unstable. Unfit. But when I didn't break, they erased the man they sent. In the back of the room, Mason Corrin stood with his arms crossed, watching every move. Behind his sunglasses, his expression was unreadable, but the faintest twitch in his jaw betrayed tension. This wasn't a press conference. It was an execution of narrative warfare, and Adrian was the one holding the blade. He stepped away from the podium for the final time, not offering thanks or closing remarks. No slogans, no applause. Just a final statement, spoken into 100 microphones at once. They wanted to destroy my name. Instead, they exposed their own methods. The lights flared brighter as he exited, the room a chaos of noise behind him. Mason met him backstage, stepping into stride beside him. You just declared war, Mason muttered, his voice low enough that only Adrian could hear. Adrian's lips curled, the faintest smile forming beneath the bandage. No, he replied. I declared memory. And memory doesn't forget. The black SUV stopped just short of the chain-linked perimeter gate. The engine stayed on. Inside, Adrian Holt sat motionless, hands folded, eyes forward. The air was thick with silence. Mason Corrin leaned in from the driver's seat, his voice low. "They're already inside." Adrian nodded. "Let's see how much noise truth can make." Federal agents were combing the Norex Systems headquarters, filing cabinets cracked open, digital servers ripped from their ports, and hard drives loaded into sealed evidence bags. The parking lot buzzed with unmarked vans and suited officials. Executives shuffled nervously through side exits, faces drawn tight with panic. It wasn't a raid, it was a reckoning. Inside, behind a tinted window of a nearby safe house, Adrian watched the scene unfold. He sat in the living room, if one could call it that. The place was sterile and dim, more panic shelter than retreat. A faint flicker from a flat-screen TV lit the space as news anchors debated the violent incident on Flight D-14, replaying looped footage of his courtroom appearance and a still frame of Gordon Vale, heavily bandaged, being wheeled into a hospital. They hadn't shown the footage of the Pliers. Mason entered the room carrying a folder. He closed the door behind him with a soft click and tossed the folder onto the table. "They found something." Adrian leaned forward. "From the hospital?" "Worse," Mason said. "Security footage. Night of the disappearance." Adrian opened the folder. Still images lined the pages, grainy, time-stamped, but damning. Gordon Vale, slumped in a wheelchair flanked by two men, one in a gray jacket, the other in dark combat boots. Faces half obscured, but posture unmistakably trained. "They're not hospital staff," Mason said. "Both are on Norex's payroll, private contractors. They walked Vale out the back exit. 2 minutes later, camera feed cuts. Adrian's fingers tightened around the paper. They erased him. Rowan Latner entered from the hallway, his suit rumpled, tie undone, but his mind still sharp. "We ran facial scans. They're not just contractors. They belong to an internal department, unlisted. Codename, Project Arc." Adrian's gaze lifted. "I've heard that name before." "You should have," Rowan said. "It's not just a department, it's an experiment." The room fell quiet. Rowan continued. "Project Arc is buried under a dozen shell subsidiaries, but it's real. Psychological stress testing. They target high-profile individuals, CEOs, military leaders, political figures. The goal is to simulate breakdown scenarios. Controlled provocation. Strategic humiliation." Adrian stood slowly, his movements deliberate. "So, I was a test subject." "You were the subject," Mason said. Vale wasn't just angry. He was conditioned, manipulated to trigger you. Everything, his language, the weapon, even his scent, was part of a psychological breach protocol. They wanted a public fracture. Adrian turned toward the window. A drone buzzed faintly outside before disappearing into the trees. Even here, they weren't safe. His voice was low, nearly a growl. They wanted to see how far a man of control could be pushed before he fractured. Mason watched him closely. They picked the wrong man. But the weight of realization pressed heavy on Adrian's chest. Every moment on that flight had been a trap laid months in advance. Every insult, every camera angle, every delay in intervention, it hadn't been chance. It had been choreography. And his pain wasn't incidental. It was the metric. His ear still throbbed beneath the bandages, though the bleeding had stopped. What hadn't stopped was the whispering, the psychological echo of being turned into a target by the very industry he'd mastered. Rowan set down another document. They wanted the footage. The scandal. But they also wanted something more. Precedent. If they could discredit you, if they could push a figure like you into a public meltdown, they could justify doing it to others. With impunity, Adrian paced slowly, each step measured. This isn't just about me. This is about silence, about what power does when no one's watching. Mason nodded, which is why you can't retaliate now. They're waiting for that. One misstep, and you become the villain they're painting. Adrian stopped pacing. I don't retaliate, he said quietly. I finish what others start. The night deepened. Outside, floodlights lit the gates of Norex's crumbling fortress. Files were disappearing into black vans like confessions into confessionals. Inside the safe house, tension simmered like heat behind glass. Rowan cleared his throat. We leak this. We spark a war. Public opinion might swing your way, or it might turn you into a cautionary tale. Adrian didn't flinch. He opened the secure drive labeled Operation Veil and began uploading a new batch of time-stamped footage, overlaying Gordon Vale's hospital exit with cross-referenced contractor logs. Each file he opened was another puzzle piece locked into place. He wasn't just defending himself now, he was building the blueprint of exposure. Then, as the last file uploaded, Mason's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, frowned, and handed it to Adrian. An anonymous message, encrypted and traced through 4 international proxies, blinked on the screen. The subject has exceeded threshold. Begin Phase 2. Adrian stared at the words. His heart didn't race. His breath didn't quicken. He simply nodded once, then returned the phone. They think silence is a trap, he said calmly. Then I'll give them noise they can't silence. He clicked shut the encrypted drive, locking it into a steel case beside his chair. And as the wind picked up outside, whispering through the trees and carrying the faint hum of machines unseen, Adrian turned back toward the window and said nothing more. Their experiment wasn't about breaking me, he thought. It was about miscalculating who I've always been. And then, as Mason and Rowan watched him with a quiet kind of reverence, Adrian whispered to no one in particular, "Then they should have studied someone else." Adrian's footsteps echoed against the marble floor as he entered the federal courthouse. No press this time. No cameras. Just the weight of truth pressing against his shoulders like armor. He walked with calm precision, his posture upright, his expression unreadable, like a man who had already fought the war and was simply here to write down its ending. The courtroom was packed. Reporters occupied the back rows, murmuring softly. Norex Systems' legal team lined the defense table in sleek suits, their eyes sharp, but their confidence brittle. Adrian stepped up to the plaintiff's table, flanked by Rowan Latner and 2 assistants. He didn't acknowledge the defense. He didn't need to. Judge Holloway, stern but fair, called the court to order. "Mr. Holt," he said without ceremony, "this is your final opportunity to testify." Adrian rose. Not hurried, not hesitant. "I have no speech," Adrian began, his voice steady, his gaze locked forward. "I have only evidence." Rowan activated the display monitor. The courtroom dimmed slightly as the screen lit up with still frames from the infamous flight, each one time-stamped and watermarked. The first showed Gordon Vale holding the pliers. The next, the initial strike. The blood. The moment Adrian retaliated. A silent gasp rippled through the gallery. The next slide shifted from images to financial records, wire transfers from Norex Systems' internal accounts to shell entities connected to Vale's medical debts. Then came security clearance logs showing Vale's unauthorized access to flight manifest data tied to Valeris Dynamics executives. The final piece was a memo, confidential, stamped with Norex's logo, outlining Project ARC, High-Stress Target Evaluation Protocols. The defense attorney stood to object, but the judge raised a hand. Let him continue. Adrian inhaled once. This was not a mid-flight altercation. It was an orchestrated psychological event. I wasn't meant to fight back. I was meant to be discredited. To be broken. The prosecutor from Norex leaned forward, whispering rapidly to his co-counsel. The energy at their table had shifted. No longer the aggressors, they were the ones bracing now. Then came the moment no one had expected. A woman stepped into the courtroom, mid-30s, tall, pale, her brown hair neatly pulled into a bun. Rowan leaned toward Adrian. "She wasn't on our witness list." The judge blinked. "Identify yourself?" She nodded. "Dr. Maren Holt, former psychological consultant for Norex Systems." The murmurs grew louder. Adrian's eyes narrowed slightly. The last name, Holt, startled him, but not as much as her next words. "I supervised the behavioral framework behind Project ARC," she said, voice trembling. "We were told it was theoretical, that no real people would be harmed." She looked toward Adrian. "Until I saw the broadcast." Gasps filled the chamber as she held up a small black USB drive. "This contains internal simulations, training footage, and voice recordings of Norex executives discussing how to engineer stressors against high-profile targets." The judge called for silence. "Dr. Holt, are you prepared to testify under oath?" "I am," she said. Her hands were shaking now, but her words came out with clarity. "They chose Adrian Holt because he had a reputation for control. They wanted to see if they could make a man of logic bleed like a man of chaos." She turned, locking eyes with the defense team. They thought if they could make a powerful man bleed publicly, no one would question the hands behind the knife. The room fell into a hush so heavy it could suffocate. The lead defense lawyer stood, only to sit back down again without a word. The judge took a long breath. "Court will recess while we review this new material. But know this, what's been presented today is not only credible, it's damning." Later that afternoon, when the court reconvened, the decision came swiftly. The jury, visibly shaken, delivered a unanimous verdict. Norex was found guilty of psychological endangerment, conspiracy to commit reputational harm, and breach of public trust. The company was ordered to pay restitution, dissolve Project ARC entirely, and submit to long-term federal oversight. Adrian did not smile. He did not bow. He simply closed his folder and stood. The judge glanced at him one final time. "You could have settled this privately," he said. Adrian met his gaze. "Because private justice teaches no one." The question came just as the lights dimmed for the broadcast segment, direct and piercing. "Do you regret what happened on that plane?" Adrian Holt didn't flinch. He had prepared for every possible version of that question, and yet hearing it live, spoken in the same clipped tone of polite journalism that so often masked judgment, still triggered something beneath his skin. Not anger, not shame, just memory. He adjusted slightly in his seat, the studio chair creaking under his deliberate movement. His posture remained upright, not rigid, but grounded, the same way he used to sit through missile briefing sessions during his air defense years, silent, alert, unreadable. The overhead lights highlighted the faint scar running along the top edge of his left ear, now smoothed into a pale line of flesh. It no longer throbbed, but it hadn't faded either. In a way, Adrian didn't want it to. "No," he said finally, his voice even and unshaken. Across from him, the journalist blinked, a little thrown by the certainty in his answer. "No hesitation?" Adrian's lips didn't move for a second. Then he tilted his head, and the studio camera, now zoomed in, caught the glint of silver in his gray eyes. "Hesitation is for men who aren't sure who they are," he said. "Regret belongs to those who acted without purpose. I knew what I was doing." The studio fell silent, the production crew frozen behind the glass. The answer wasn't inflammatory, it was too calm for that, but it carried weight, the kind that lingered in the air like pressure before a storm. Months had passed since the courtroom verdict. The media had long since shifted to new scandals, new targets, but for Adrian Holt, the aftermath had only begun. At Valaris Dynamics, restructuring hadn't been cosmetic, it had been total. Board members had been removed, internal security overhauled, and every leadership role reevaluated under an ethical review committee. Adrian had personally installed oversight protocols to prevent psychological manipulation of any kind, not just because of Norex, but because he understood now how easily lines blurred when ambition was left unchecked. The Veritas program was born from those ashes. It wasn't a press-friendly initiative, it was a war room, a fortress for the unheard. Its offices were housed in a converted brick warehouse on the outskirts of Halebrook, far from Valeris headquarters, as if intentionally distanced from corporate polish. Inside, Adrian walked the floors like a field general, sleeves rolled up, reviewing testimonies from whistleblowers, system vulnerability audits, and files of corporate retaliation cases submitted from across the country. Men who'd been silenced, men who'd been sacrificed, men who hadn't had a camera rolling when it mattered. He didn't seek publicity for it. But word spread fast. The Veritas program attracted former analysts, security officers, lawyers, and Mason Corrin. The ex-detective had officially retired from law enforcement, though Adrian doubted Mason would ever stop investigating. Now, Mason ran Veritas's investigative division, digging into companies that used subtle pressure, covert surveillance, or what he called soft sabotage to destabilize competitors and employees alike. "We used to think physical threats were the only ones that left scars," Mason once said over black coffee in Adrian's office. "Turns out, silence leaves deeper ones." Adrian nodded. "And silence is harder to photograph." The settlement money from the Norex trial had been significant, but Adrian hadn't kept it. Every cent went into building the Veritas infrastructure, legal protections, encrypted intake systems, mental health access for victims of corporate retaliation. It wasn't charity, it was architecture, the kind that held institutions accountable. But the world still wanted a face. So when the Global News Channel requested a sit-down interview, live, no delay, Adrian agreed, not to rehabilitate his image, but to place the truth, unfiltered, into the bloodstream of public memory. He wore no makeup for the broadcast, just a tailored dark blue blazer, open collar, and the same focused expression that once commanded fighter squadrons. The backdrop was simple, a plain, slate-gray wall and a single framed plaque behind him. The plaque had no corporate logos, just a phrase in engraved silver. "The ear that heard violence now listens for truth." Adrian hadn't chosen the words for effect. He chose them because they were his. He remembered whispering them to himself the day the court ruled in his favor, the day he knew the fight was no longer about him, but about every man caught in a war he didn't choose. As the interview wrapped, the journalist, clearly unsettled by Adrian's candor, reached for a final, softer question. "Do you think justice has been served?" Adrian didn't answer immediately. His gaze shifted past the lights, through the reflection in the glass, and into the ghost of an airplane cabin where blood had soaked his collar and truth had bled before it breathed. He thought of Gordon Vale, not as a monster, but as a man engineered into desperation. He thought of Norex, of the others still watching, still planning, still silent. "Justice," he said at last, "isn't what heals, it's what remembers." She tried to take his pride and lost her own reputation in seconds. If you believe real strength is calm under fire, subscribe now. Because justice doesn't raise its voice, it lets the truth speak. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores racism, arrogance, and the abuse of power in public spaces. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage reflection on justice, equality, and the importance of self-control and accountability.